Attention please, guys.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Same from.
Okay. Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Namaste, and welcome back at lecture on physiology. Thank you, guys. Please turn off your microphones and let's start. And today we're gonna be talking about muscle contraction. The muscle contraction, guys, we teach you for in life, not for an exam, you know. Please switch off your microphones, please, all of you. When most people think of muscles, they think of the muscles that are visible, yeah, that are visible just under our skin, particularly of the limbs. There are skeletal muscles, so named because most of them move the skeleton. But there are two other types of muscle in the body, which with distinctly different jobs. You know about them? What's two different
Yes,
types?
teacher.
Skeletal muscles and what else?
Smooth muscles and skeletal muscles.
Skeletal, smooth, and
Cardiac muscle.
cardiac muscle. Thank you.
The three type muscles are there: smooth, cardiac, and skeletal.
Yes. Yes, thank you. Okay. After studying this chapter, you will be able to switch off microphones, please. After studying this chapter, you will be able to describe the organization of muscle, specify the functions of skeletal muscle tissue, identify the structural components of sarcomere. This is small unit of each muscle fiber. Explain the key steps involved in the muscle contraction. Compare the different types of muscle twitch, and at the end of our lecture we will examine exercise and muscle performance. Our first question, the organization of muscle at the tissue level. The body contains three types of muscle tissue, as we said: skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. First type is skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle fibers are multinucleated structures that compose the skeletal muscle. Please switch off microphones, guys. Please switch off. Next is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle fibers each have 1 to 2 nuclei and are physically and electrically they connected to each other so that the entire heart contracts as one unit called, who knows?
Sir, during palpation and contraction, systolic and dystolic.
Okay, connection between cardiac cells.
Synapses.
What?
Synapses.
No. Thank you. Synapses. It's synapses are contact between nerve cells and muscle cells, but contacts between cardiac cells called a syncytium. I think you know syncytium, functional syncytium in the cardiac muscle. Okay, this is connection between cardiac cells. Because the
Gap junction is present.
What?
Gap junction.
Junction between nervous and muscle cells. Yes, junction between nervous and muscle cells, between neurons called synapses. Because the actin and myosin are not arranged in such regular fashion in smooth muscle, the cytoplasm of a smooth muscle fiber has a uniform, non-striated appearance, resulting in the name smooth muscle. In this chapter, we will examine the structure and function mainly of skeletal muscle, okay? Mainly of skeletal muscle. Functions of skeletal muscles. The best known feature of skeletal muscle is its ability to contract and cause our movement. Skeletal muscles act not only to produce movement but also to stop movement, such as resisting gravity to maintain posture. Skeletal muscles also protect internal organs, uh, particularly abdominal and pelvic organs, by acting as an external barrier or shield to external trauma and supporting the weight of the organs. Skeletal muscle are located throughout the body at the opening of internal tract to control the movement of various substances. These muscles, allow functions such as swallowing, what else? Urination, defecation, and other functions that under voluntary control. Skeletal muscles contribute to the maintenance of homeostasis in the body by generating heat. Muscle contraction requires energy, and when ATP is broken down, heat is produced. Skeletal muscle are organs that contain connective tissue. You can see this slide, in this picture, connective tissue, blood vessels, nerves, blood vessels, arteries and veins, nerves, skeletal muscle tissue, single skeletal muscle cells. Because skeletal muscle cells are long and cylindrical, they are commonly referred to as muscle fibers. So, muscle cell equals muscle fiber. Skeletal muscle fibers can be quite large for human cells with diameters approximately 100 micrometer and length up to 30 centimeters. 30 centimeters is approximately 12 inches. Yeah. The plasma membrane of muscle fibers is called the sarcolemma. Sarcolemma. The cytoplasm is referred to as sarcoplasm, and the specialized smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which stores, releases, and retrieves calcium ions, is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Sarcoplasmic reticulum at this picture has a yellow color.
Teacher, could you please explain the difference between fascia and fasciculus?
It's okay, later in this lecture I will explain, okay? The sarcoplasmic reticulum is a yellow color at this picture. Sarcoplasmic reticulum specialized part which stores, releases, and retrieves calcium ions, okay? Whole muscle, and fascicles. Fascicles is several muscle fibers, several muscle cells that surrounded by special fascia. Okay, have you got it?
Yes, sir.
Whole muscle, fascicle that includes several muscle cells, several muscle fibers, and several muscle fibers that contains of muscle fibers, and this is fascicle. fascicle. 10 or 100 muscle fibers is fascicle. And then whole muscle contains of several of muscle fascicles. Okay, to better understand structure of myofibrils, let's watch some video, okay? Each muscle fiber itself contains cylindrical organelles known as myofibrils. Each muscle fiber contains hundreds or thousands of myofibrils, which themselves are bundles of proteins called actin and myosin. These run the length of the muscle fiber and are important in muscle contraction. Surrounding the myofibril, there is a network of tubules and channels called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, where calcium is stored, which is also important for muscle contraction. Each myofibril can be broken down into functional repeating segments called sarcomeres, which are the basis for muscle contraction theory known as sliding filament theory. Okay, have you got it, guys? Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Uh-huh.
sir.
Let's watch, let's see closer. The sarcomere. The sarcomere is the functional unit of the muscle fiber. Because the actin, green color here, because the actin and its troponin, tropomyosin complex form strands that are thinner than the myosin, it's called thin filaments. Thin filaments. Muscle has 4 types of proteins: actin, myosin, troponin, and tropomyosin. So green is actin filament or thin filament of the sarcomere. Likewise, because the myosin strands and their multiple heads projecting from the center of the sarcomere toward, but not all the way to the Z discs, have more mass and are thicker, they are called the thick filament of the sarcomere. So here thick filaments, myosin filaments, myosin protein is purple. Yes, okay, purple. This is actin, thin filament, actin. Actin has troponin and tropomyosin molecules, and myosin with their heads or bridges here. Myosin, thick filament. Muscle contraction. Here closer, actin, the structure of a thin filament, actin filament with tropomyosin molecules and troponin molecules. And thick filament, myosin molecule, consists of myosin head, hinge of myosin head, and myosin tail. Myosin tail. Here you can see different types of lines and bands of sarcomere. For example, Z lane, M lane, Z lane fixed actin molecules, and M line fixed thick filaments, myosin filaments. For skeletal muscle fiber to contract, its membrane must first be excited. In other words, it must be stimulated to fire an action potential coming from the nervous system. If you watch previous lecture about action potential, you know about excitable tissue, yes, and about signaling from nervous system due to action, action potential. Action potential travels along the axon of a motor neuron to terminate at the neuromuscular junction. Here you can see closer. Action potential travels along the axon of a motor neuron to terminate at the neuromuscular junction. The T-tubulus carry the action potential into the interior of the cell. T-tubulus, here you can see T-tubulus plus terminal cistern, two terminal cistern, couple of terminal cisterns called triad, T-tubuli, and two terminal cisterns of sarcoplasmic reticulum is triad. T-tubulus carry the action potential into the interior of the cell, which triggers the opening of calcium channels in the membrane of the adjacent sarcoplasmic reticulum, causing calcium to diffuse out of the sarcoplasmic reticulum and into the sarcoplasm. As long as calcium ions remain in the sarcoplasm to bind to troponin, which keeps the actin binding sites unshielded, the muscle fiber will continue to shorten to an anatomical limit. Have you got it? Okay? Calcium. Yes, calcium, very, very necessary component, very necessary substrate to muscle contraction. Relaxation. Muscle contraction usually stops when signaling from the motor neuron ends, which repolarizes the sarcolemma and T-tubulus and closes the voltage-gated calcium channels in the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Calcium ions are then pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which causes the tropomyosin to reshield or recover the binding sites on the actin strands. A muscle also can stop contracting when it runs out of ATP and becomes fatigued. I know, guys, it's very, very difficult, hard questions, so I try several times explain you, and then we're gonna watch some movie that will help you and will be useful for you. Steps of muscle contraction. Steps of muscle contraction on the filament level, on the microscopic level. The first step is in the process of contraction is for calcium to bind to troponin. Calcium bind to troponin so that tropomyosin can slide away from the binding site on the actin strands. Okay? Have you got it? Did you understand? Calcium, yes, calcium bind.
No, teacher, please repeat once.
Calcium binds troponin, so tropomyosin slide away from the binding site on the active strands because then head of myosin would link with this site, with this part of actin. So next step, second step, tropomyosin, as we said, slides away. Where is tropomyosin? There is no tropomyosin here. Tropomyosin slides away due to calcium binding with troponin, and the binding sites on the actin strands, active site exposure. Did you understand? Active site exposure. Okay, it's free for binding of head of myosin. Next step, this process, previous process, allows the myosin heads to bind to these exposed binding sites and form cross bridge. Myosin heads to bind to these exposed binding sites where was tropomyosin. Okay? here. During the power stroke, the phosphate generated in the previous contraction cycle is released. This results in the myosin head pivoting toward the center of the sarcomere, after which the attached ADP and phosphate group are released. Next step, a new molecule of ATP attaches to the myosin head, causing the cross bridge to detach. The myosin head, the myosin head hydrolyzes ATP to ADP and adenosine diphosphate and phosphate to ADP and phosphate, inorganic phosphate, which returns the myosin to the cooked position. Myosin reactivation. This process repeats several times during one muscle contraction, 50, 60 times. Heads binding, detaches, and forms muscle contraction. In order to better understand, I said this is it's very hard, difficult question. To better understand this mechanism, let's watch some video, guys.
Smooth muscle tissues are involuntary. You do not consciously control their actions. Skeletal muscle works under voluntary control. Skeletal muscles are composed of bundles of muscle fibers. Muscle fibers are long cylindrical cells containing several nuclei. Muscles will contract or relax when they receive signals from the nervous system. A neuromuscular junction is the site of the signal exchange. This is where the synaptic bulb of an axon terminal and muscle fiber connect. Muscle fibers are composed of many myofibrils. A myofibril contains contractile units called sarcomeres. Sarcomeres run adjacent to one another down the length of the myofibril. Each sarcomere consists of alternating thick and thin protein filaments, giving skeletal muscle its striated appearance. The muscle contracts when these filaments slide past each other. The thick filaments are myosin, which are anchored at the center of the sarcomere, called the M line. The thin filaments are composed of the protein actin, which are anchored to the Z lines on the outer edges of the sarcomere. Because the actin filaments are anchored to the Z lines, the sarcomere shortens from both sides when actin filaments slide along the myosin filaments. Although the action between the filaments is described as sliding, the myosin filament actually pulls the actin along its length. The cross bridges of the myosin filaments attach to the actin filaments and exert force on them to move. This action is known as the sliding filament mechanism of muscle contraction. In this model, the sarcomeres shorten without the thick or thin filaments changing in length. A contraction begins when a bound ATP is hydrolyzed to ADP and inorganic phosphate. This causes the myosin head to extend and can attach to a binding site on actin, forming a cross bridge. An action called the power stroke is triggered, allowing myosin to pull the actin filament toward the M line, thereby shortening the sarcomere. ADP and inorganic phosphate are released during the power stroke. The myosin remains attached to actin until a new molecule of ATP binds, freeing the myosin to either go through another cycle of binding and more contraction, or remain unattached to allow the muscle to relax. Muscle contractions are controlled by the actions of calcium. The thin actin filaments are associated with regulatory proteins called troponin and tropomyosin. When a muscle is relaxed, tropomyosin blocks the cross-bridge binding sites on actin. When calcium ion levels are high enough and ATP is present, calcium ions bind to the troponin, which displaces tropomyosin, exposing the myosin binding sites on actin. This allows myosin to attach to a binding site on actin, forming a cross bridge. Calcium ions are stored in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and are released in response to signals from the nervous system to contract. Neurotransmitter molecules are released from a neuron and bind to receptors, which depolarizes the membrane of the muscle fiber. The electrical impulse travels down the T-tubules and opens calcium stores. Calcium ions flow to the myofibrils, where they trigger a muscle contraction. As the actin and myosin slide along each other, the entire sarcomere shortens as the Z lines draw closer to the M line. As the sarcomeres in myofibrils contract, the entire muscle fiber will shorten. When muscle fibers contract in unison, a muscle can produce enough force to move the body, allowing you to take notes.
Joint. Isometric contraction involves sarcomere shortening and increasing muscle tension, but don't move a load, as the force produced cannot overcome the resistance provided by the load. And the second is an isotonic contraction, second type, where the tension in the muscle stays constant. A load is moved as the length of the muscle changes, shortens. There are two types of isotonic contractions, concentric and eccentric. A concentric contraction involves the muscle shortening to move a load, yeah? And eccentric contraction occurs as the muscle tension diminishes and the muscle lengthens. Next question, guys. A muscle twitch. A muscle twitch, single action potential from a motor neuron will produce a single contraction in the muscle fibers. This isolated contraction is called a twitch. Okay? Not contraction, twitch. Isolated contraction. A single muscle twitch has a latent period, a contraction phase when tension increases, and a relaxation phase when tension decreases, or in first stage, in contraction stage, a muscle became shorter. Yeah. If the fibers are stimulated while a previous twitch is still occurring, the second twitch will be stronger. This response is called wave summation. Wave summation. When the stimulus frequency is so high that the relaxation phase disappears completely, the contractions become continuous. This is called tetanus. If the frequency of motor neuron signaling increases, summation and the subsequent muscle tension in the motor units continues to rise until it reaches a peak point. The tension at this point is about 3 to 4 times greater than the tension of a single twitch, a state referred to as incomplete tetanus. Incomplete tetanus, like this, incomplete tetanus. If the stimulus frequency is so high that the relaxation phase, this phase, relaxation phase disappears completely, contractions become continuous in a process called complete tetanus. Complete tetanus. Incomplete tetanus and complete tetanus. Muscle tone and atrophy. Muscle cells can change in size. New cells are not formed when muscle grow. Instead, structural proteins are added to muscle fibers in a process called hypertrophy. so cell diameter increases. The reverse, when structural proteins are lost and muscle mass decreases, is called atrophy, muscle atrophy. Endurance exercise, slow fibers are predominantly used in endurance exercises that require little force but involve numerous repetitions. The aerobic metabolism used by slow twitch fibers allows them to maintain contractions over long periods, like marathon runners. Long distance runners have a larger number of slow oxidative fibers and relatively few fast oxidative and fast glycolytic fibers. Slow oxidative SO, fast oxidative FO, and fast glycolytic FG fibers. Uh, resistant exercise. Resistant exercise is opposed to endurance exercise, require large amount of fast glycolytic fibers to produce short, powerful movement that are not repeated over long periods. So guys, now you can leave our conference if you want. If you don't want, you have opportunity to watch some interesting movie, short interesting movie. Let's start. Okay, I think it was a very motivated video for you.
Yes, sir.
Stop lying on the sofa and go to
Sir,
the
I will
gym
join gym from now.
to run. Okay, guys, that's it. Our time is over. If you have some questions, please write down to our chat, our general chat, or my private chat. That's it. Thank you. Bye bye. Good luck.
Thank
Best
you,
of
sir.
luck.
Thank you, sir. Bye bye.
Thank you, sir.
Best of luck.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Shout out to you,
Thank you.
Oscar.
Bye.